Bipartisanship is garbage. That's the straightforward and accurate title of Ben Burgis's latest piece in Jacobin, which I certainly enjoyed. I enjoyed it so much that it inspired me to want to elaborate on it even further. So definitely check out his piece. But I want to talk about how bipartisanship was the scapegoat when the Obama administration dropped the mere notion of providing a public option in the Affordable Care Act. The alleged need for bipartisanship also paved the way for the weak sauce Wall Street reform bill known as Dodd-Frank following the 2008 economic collapse. Bipartisanship also worked its magic on Obama's foreign policy decisions, which he only expanded upon, in the failed Bush era, from the failed Bush era. And he, of course, added this dollop of drone strikes in addition to what Bush was already doing. Now, in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, the president had a lot of power. He not only had political capital as a newly elected president, but Democrats held control of both the House and the Senate. They had all the levers of power at their disposal, and they decided not to use it. So when they failed to deliver for their base, the consequences were clear in the 2010 midterms.
Campaign 2010 proved to be an historic election for the Republican Party and a decisive defeat for President Obama and many of his fellow Democrats. Angry voters flocked to the GOP, which will take control of the House of Representatives. CBS News estimates that the new Congress will have 235 Republicans and 181 Democrats. Some races are still undecided, with the GOP gaining at least 58 seats. The Democrats will keep control of the Senate just barely, with a much smaller majority, as Republicans gained at least 6 seats, with 3 races still undecided. CBS News estimates the Senate will have 49 Democrats, 2 independents, and 46 Republicans come January.
I mean, it was a thrashing, a shellacking, and Obama was asked what his feelings were about it.
Do you see 19 state legislatures go to the other side? Governorships in swing states, the Democratic Party setback. What does it feel like?
Feels bad.
It feels bad. Now, did Obama learn any lessons? I mean, when you fail to deliver for your base, when you pander to the Republican Party after the incredibly unpopular Bush administration, you should probably learn to move away from that ideology of bipartisanship, right? So did he learn anything?
My goal is to make sure that we don't have a huge spike in taxes for middle-class families. So my goal is to sit down with Speaker-elect Boehner and Mitch McConnell, Harry and Nancy, sometime in the next few weeks, and see where we can move forward in a way that, first of all, does no harm, that extends those tax cuts that are very important for middle-class families, also extends those provisions that are important to encourage businesses to invest.
Now, as we know, the increase, or I should say the extension of Bush-era tax cuts did not overwhelmingly benefit working people. They benefited the people at the very top, individuals who are already high-income earners, and that's who Obama was looking out for. But what's incredible about all of this is that even after the Democratic Party suffered the consequences of failing to deliver for their voters, and even though their insane scapegoat of, well, we needed bipartisanship, we had to try to unify the country, was hollow, most people knew it, the corporate media continued celebrating the notion of bipartisan legislation. In fact, they even prioritized it in 2012 during the presidential election. Here's an example of how one of the debates were.
As president, I will sit down on day one, actually the day after I get elected. I'll sit down with leaders, the Democratic leaders, as well as Republican leaders, and continue, as we did in my state. We met every Monday for a couple hours, talked about the issues and the challenges in our state in that case. We have to work on a collaborative basis.
My philosophy has been, I will take ideas from anybody, Democrat or Republican, as long as they're advancing the cause of making middle-class families stronger and giving ladders of opportunity into the middle class. That's how we cut taxes for middle-class families and small businesses. That's how we cut $1 trillion of spending that wasn't advancing that cause.
Ooh, yeah, tax cuts and austerity. You know, voters absolutely love that, right? Now, Obama went on to win his reelection campaign. He won in 2012. The 2014 midterms were not good for the Democrats because they continued to fail to deliver on what they campaigned for. They failed to materially improve the lives of the very people who elected them in these positions of power in the first place. And instead of taking bold action as the most powerful party in the country, they just decided to continue caving to Republicans. Now, they didn't cave to Republicans in the interest of bipartisanship. They caved to Republicans because Republicans represented corporate interests. And increasingly, throughout the decades, Democrats were also looking out for the best interests of corporations and the very, very wealthy. So fast forward to where we are today, where Democrats do find themselves in somewhat of a similar situation as they did in 2008. Now, there are smaller margins in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. There's a very slim majority for Democrats, but they do have all the levers of power, with the exception of the Supreme Court. If they wanted to, they could easily pass legislation that they want. They have tools in their toolbox in order to do that. The arguments that we hear in regard to the Senate parliamentarian are honestly irrelevant, because the executive branch, Joe Biden, can easily throw out the Senate parliamentarian. He can unilaterally fire her. And he can also apply pressure to Senate Democrats to do away with the legislative filibuster so legislation doesn't get blocked in the Senate. It could actually pass. Now, instead of that bold action from the most powerful party in the country, we get garbage like this.
We agreed on infrastructure. We made serious compromises on both ends. There is, and they'll give you the numbers. But they did not, and I understand their position. Republicans and this group did not want to go along with any of my family plan issues, the child care tax credits, the human infrastructure that I talk about. We've all agreed that none of us got what we wanted. I clearly didn't get all I wanted. They gave more than I think maybe they were inclined to give in the first place. But this reminds me of the days we used to get an awful lot done up in the United States Congress. We actually worked with them. We had bipartisan deals. Bipartisan deals means compromise.
Honestly, even Joe Biden didn't seem too excited about the bipartisan deal. It seemed like he had a really hard time selling this bipartisan deal, and for good reason. As Ben Burgess points out in his Jacobin piece, the gap between Biden's initial infrastructure proposal and the bipartisan bill is a catastrophe in human terms. What it has going for it is bipartisanship. So why don't we take a look at what bipartisanship looks like, or what bipartisanship leads to in regard to the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan version of it. The original bill, for instance, had $387 billion for housing, schools, and buildings. The bipartisan version has $0. The original infrastructure bill had $400 billion for home and community-based care. The bipartisan version has $0. Even clean energy tax credits, an absurdly inadequate response to the climate crisis, plummeted from $363 billion to $0. Other climate measures were also scrapped. And we also can't forget the fun asset recycling scheme in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the same one that I did a decode about a few weeks ago. Basically, it would privatize public infrastructure so corporations not only manage that infrastructure, but implement all sorts of fees and tolls that amount to regressive taxes. I mean, it's so bad that even AOC mentioned it during a recent conversation with Jake Tapper.
And I want to be clear that the investments in the bipartisan bill are not all Candyland. There are some of these quote unquote pay-fors that are very alarming that we need to see the language on. For example, some of the language around privatizing public infrastructure, putting toll roads, leasing public infrastructure to private entities are very concerning and should be concerning to every American. So we really need to see that language and see what's put in there until it reaches, when it reaches the House. Bipartisan doesn't always mean that it's in the interest of the public good, frankly. Sometimes there's a lot of corporate lobbyist giveaways in some of these bills.
In fact, bipartisanship typically means that the end result of the policy is not in the interest of the public good. More often than not, because of corporate influence, the outcome of these policy decisions ends up benefiting corporations and hurting workers. And that's certainly what we see in the bipartisan version of the infrastructure bill. Now, progressives in the House claim that they will block that bill unless there is a clear path forward for the more robust $3.5 trillion reconciliation version of the infrastructure bill, which is supposed to pass along with the bipartisan deal. We'll see what happens. I think that strategy of splitting up the infrastructure proposal into two separate bills is a disastrous strategy. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's focus on the hollow nature of these bipartisan arguments. When it comes to calls for bipartisanship, American voters obviously don't even care, really, who Senator Joe Manchin is inviting to his COVID-riddled boat parties. Americans don't care about how friendly lawmakers are with one another. They don't care about unity in Congress. If anything, they care about what their elected officials are providing in terms of materially benefiting their lives, improving their lives. They care about results and how government can step in once they're being abused in their workplaces or when they're being paid too little. And when it comes to bread and butter issues, Democrats tend to abandon them in the honor of bipartisanship, which we all know is BS. So, for instance, a new poll for the Alliance for Retired Americans found that older voters want Medicare to negotiate directly with pharmaceutical companies. So, conducted by the firm Lake Research Partners, the new poll shows that 87% of voters over the age of 65, including 89% of Democrats and 87% of Republicans and 81% of independents, support allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices, which it is currently barred from doing under federal law. By the way, how do you think that federal law came about in the first place? Corporate interests. Now, would these voters switch their political party, their party loyalties in order to support a candidate who would fight to ensure that Medicare can negotiate drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies? Well, the survey actually found that 31% of Republican seniors would be more likely to vote for a Democrat who supports ongoing congressional efforts to allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices, indicating a substantial political upside for candidates who back the idea, which would lower federal spending by an estimated $456 billion over 10 years and potentially save patients thousands of dollars. Now, when you look at the Democratic Party, the results are even more stark. So 60% of Democratic seniors said they would be less likely to support a Democratic candidate opposed to this popular reform. Now, progressive members of Congress are attempting to include a provision in the infrastructure bill that would allow for Medicare to negotiate drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies. They also want to expand Medicare through a provision in the more robust $3.5 trillion reconciliation version of the infrastructure bill. Now, we'll see what happens, but what's fascinating is how corporate interests are already fighting against that. And we'll go back to that in just a second. But let's go to Joe Manchin, who's been front and center in this fight to maintain the Senate filibuster. He claims maintaining the Senate filibuster is important. It pressures lawmakers to work together. It leads toward unity. And we want that, right? Americans care so much about passing legislation in a bipartisan way, regardless of what the outcome of that actual policy is. Obviously, we know that's not true, but let's hear a little bit from Senator Manchin himself and how he tries to advocate for maintaining the Senate filibuster.
and I've always been about bipartisanship. I've always tried to work in a bipartisan way, and I've voted in a bipartisan way in the last 10 years of the Senate. So I'm doing what I have always done. Let's unite this country. We don't need to be divided any further.
What the White House would say is on an issue, let's say infrastructure, which is key to the president's economic agenda, what they would say is there's a way to do this with Democrats alone. It's the same method that was used to pass President Trump's tax cut, but you won't agree to do that. And since you won't agree to do that, it takes all of the leverage away from the White House. Now, in order to pass an infrastructure package, it requires 60 votes to get past a filibuster. So it's not just that you want bipartisanship. They would argue what you're doing is basically putting all the negotiating leverage in the hands of those 10 Republicans that would be needed for the president to pass anything.
We need to work within the framework of what we have. There's ways that we can move forward.
Now, behind closed doors, while talking to billionaire donors, Joe Manchin makes clear that it's actually nearly impossible to pass anything in a bipartisan fashion. So he calls on them to entice, or a more appropriate word is bribe, Republican senators with future job offers if they vote along with Democrats on the January 6th commission. Notice that this isn't a discussion about any type of economic policy or the infrastructure bill or coronavirus relief funds. He wants to entice Republicans to vote in favor of a January 6th commission to investigate what happened in the Capitol, because that investigation doesn't upset corporate interests. That investigation is something that both Democrats and Republicans can vote in favor of without upsetting their corporate donors. And so this video that was provided to us by The Intercept gives you a sense of what Manchin's true intentions and motivations are. This is him speaking to the billionaire donors in a leaked video.
Right now, what I'm asking for, I need to go back. I need to find 3 more good Republican senators that'll vote for the commission, so that at least we can tamp them down to where people say Republicans won't even do the simple common sense of basically voting to do a commission that was truly bipartisan. So once that people, and it just really emboldens the far left, saying, I showed you, how's that bipartisan working for you now, Joe? Those are the hard things. That's where I need help, Dan. Dan, here's the thing. Let me just tell you. Okay, I'll give you some names here. Roy Blunt is just a good friend of mine, a great guy, okay? You would like to think that Roy's retiring. If some of you all who might be working with Roy in his next life could tell him that it'd be nice to help our country.
You hear what he's saying, right? Hey, Roy Blunt, my Republican colleague, why don't you offer him a job for when his term is up? As long as he votes in favor of the January 6th commission, so we can give Americans this illusion of bipartisanship working in Congress. That way, it'll bolster Joe Manchin's argument for maintaining the legislative filibuster in the Senate, which effectively serves as a giant roadblock to passing any legislation that benefits working people. I mean, it is so clear and so blunt. And that audio was completely ignored by the corporate media because of course it was. Of course it was. They're not, same corporate donors fund advertising on corporate media. So of course they're not going to talk about that audio. But it's important to know what Manchin's real motivations are. Corporate Democrats want to use bipartisanship or arguments of bipartisanship as a cover for why they can't pass legislation that actually improves people's lives. And they don't do it because they don't believe in that legislation. Who knows what they believe? They do it on behalf of corporate interests. Manchin's calls for bipartisanship or bipartisan negotiations resulted in more means testing and less weekly financial assistance for unemployment benefits in the coronavirus relief bill. He claimed that he was, cutting down that assistance because he wanted negotiations in a bipartisan way. So he wanted to, compromise with his Republican colleagues. But did a single Republican lawmaker vote in favor of that legislation? No, not a single one, either in the House or the Senate. Calls for bipartisanship, again, provide cover for what corporate interests really want. And we can take a quick look at the campaign funding that took place during the 2020 election. So Kim Moody for Against the Current writes that according to Open Secrets, it cost about $14 billion up and down the ballot, which was over twice what it spent in 2016. In fact, fundraising and spending are pretty good indicators of which party is likely to win in any given election cycle. So in 2020, Democrats outspent Republicans $6.9 billion to $3.8 billion, deregulated outside donations, mostly from wealthy individuals, not including those to party committees, came to $3 billion, of which 2/3 were via super PACs. Now, the two major parties themselves raised another $3.6 billion, much of it from wealthy donors as well. And as we know, these giant fundraising figures from corporate donors pale in comparison to the influence that the average American voter has. It also pales in comparison to the campaign contributions that unions were able to provide. So in contrast, social welfare and union spending combined scarcely passed the $100 million mark. Open Secrets calculated that only about 22% of funds raised by all candidates came from small donations of $200 or less. And if you look at Congress specifically, of the 537 congressional candidates that Open Secrets reported on in 2020, only 12 got half or more of their contributions from small donors, while only 37 got a third or more from that source. The other 500 relied primarily on larger donations. So in other words, as Kim Moody states, the nation's rich paid for the election, and they will be its major beneficiaries. And we're seeing that play out already. We saw it play out in how the Biden coronavirus relief bill was cut down, cut back, and included additional means testing that was unnecessary. We're seeing it happen with the negotiations taking place in the infrastructure proposal. And we're going to continue seeing it because at the end of the day, when you don't have strong labor and you have corporate interests funding both parties handsomely, the best interests of working people are not really considered. The end result tends to be policy that overwhelmingly benefits the wealthy, overwhelmingly benefits businesses. Now, going back to that poll showing that older voters would literally switch parties to support a candidate who would allow Medicare to directly negotiate with pharmaceutical companies to lower drug prices. There are some progressive lawmakers who are trying to include a provision in the infrastructure bill that would do just that. However, this is where corporate interests come into play, because Jake Johnson over at Common Dreams writes that despite its popularity, the proposal is likely to run up against some opposition from big pharma-backed Democrats in the House. In a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in May, a group of Democrats led by Representatives Scott Peters and Jake Auchincloss expressed opposition to H.R. 3, which would empower Medicare to directly negotiate prices for a limited number of prescription drugs. When Big Pharma is funding the campaigns of these corporate Democrats, they are going to fight against what their own voters overwhelmingly support. We see that happening in the Democratic Party today. We're going to continue seeing that happen with the Democratic Party. But the good news is there is a way out. There is a way to build labor power in order to mitigate the impact of corporate rule and corporate money. And the only way to really do that is to get involved in organizing your workplace, something that we'll have a lengthier discussion about with our guest today, Vivek Chibber. But before we get to that, Nando, I wanted to bring you in and get your thoughts.
Well, I think that, it's funny that bipartisanship always works when increasing the defense budget every year. That's that's never an issue. If you enjoyed this clip from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. You can also watch the full episode or catch any future live stream by clicking the join button below and becoming a Jacobin YouTube member. Thank you.